Okay, we're going to continue in of the Gemara Hey Amid Beis 5b, and let's bring up the page here. So we learned about last week. Hold on, which is the right page? I guess it's this. Hold on, here we go. So we're learning over here about Rebbe. So just to we go back a bit. We learned in the bottom of page 5b, 5a. We learned that it says Rebbe not an Atiya bePurim. He planted a tree or planting on Purim, and it said Rachatz bekroine shel tzipori b'shiva aser b'tamas, and he bathed on the 17th of Tammuz. Well, Bikush la'akar Tisha B'av, and he wanted to change. And later we learned he tried to have that whenever Tisha B'av would fall out on a Shabbos, the 9th of Av, meaning the fast. Today the law is we fast on the 10th on Sunday. That once it's pushed off, given the itche, if it's pushed off, we don't continue we don't fast on the Sunday. So on the 17th of Tammuz, that's pretty much the law. We don't have the severity of the fast of 17th of Tammuz like we do of Tisha B'av or Yom Kippur. But with regard to uprooting Tisha B'av, from if it falls out on a Shabbat, on that point we don't. The rabbis did not agree with Rebbe. Again, you have to remember, Rebbe is the author of the Mishnah, the one who puts together everything. He's the conclusion of the era of the Tanoim. But nevertheless, the rabbis didn't agree with Rebbe because everything is an open conversation, and the rabbis do not agree with Rebbe about uprooting Tisha B'av in that scenario where it falls out on Shabbos to given the itche that once we push it off, we push it off. Although, like I said many times, the Rebbe quoted this many times. The idea of when something negative is being pushed off, just push it off for good. But either way, that was the first two laws. Now we're going back to the first law or the first happening that Rebbe did, which obviously Rebbe did it, and the fact that the Gemara is telling us this, Rebbe did many things, I'm sure, in his life. The fact that the Gemara is telling us this is that there's something of significance. Like when he bathed on the 17th of Tammuz, he bathed b'dikronos in the public, in the market, so everyone could see he was making a statement. So here also seemingly he'd be making a statement that Rebbe planted a planting on Purim. So now we're going to go into this question. Rebbe heichi not an etiya bePurim. Listen, Megillah is about 30, I think, pages or so. And we'll hopefully, by the time next year Purim comes around, it says the Jewish people stayed fast with Mordechai and Esther for a year. So if we stay with it for a year, hopefully by next year Purim, with Mashiach, we can make a siyum on Masechtas Megillah. But until then, we'll be learning about Purim throughout the next year at least. So the Rebbe said, so the Rebbe heichi not netiya bePurim. How did Rebbe do a planting on Purim? What's the problem? The issue is v'hatani Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef teaches that simcha mishta v'yamtiv. Okay, we have to remember something important about the story of Esther and Mordechai. What Esther and Mordechai were trying to accomplish is not always what actually was accomplished. Meaning, we find, Avi, I think you're a Balkor, maybe you recognize this, but we find that in the chapters, the later chapters, when it talks about Esther and Mordechai putting together the holiday of Purim, so to say, so there was an automatic holiday the first year, obviously, right? Everyone's life is in danger and everyone's happy, celebrating. Comes the second year, there was a concern, obviously, clearly from Esther and Mordechai, that the Jewish people would not make Purim into a holiday. So they had to emphasize going forward that this is a holiday. And Mordechai was, at least in the beginning, the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Later, they say, according to some opinions, we're going to learn that he was demoted a few steps down when he got more involved in communal work. So he was, so they kind of needed someone else to, I guess, run the Sanhedrin because of his responsibilities to the crown. But nevertheless, they were very important people. So here we have Mordechai and Esther trying to establish the holiday. So we're going to see that not everything that they tried was accepted. So it says like this. Vatani Rav Yosef learned that in the Megillah it says that about the holiday of Purim, it's Simcha, Mishte, V'Yom Tov. So you have to have joy, festivities, and it's a holiday. So we see clearly that the Purim is a holiday. If it's a holiday, like in holidays, you can't plant. Simcha, what does Simcha mean? Melamed Shasurim Behesped. What does it mean to be happy? What is it coming to exclude? It's coming to exclude. You should not eulogize on Purim. Mishta, what does it mean? Mishta, you should feast. Melamed, it's coming to exclude. Sha'asr b'tainus, you're not allowed to fast. V'yom tiv, and what does it mean? It's a holiday. These are not. You have to remember the rabbis didn't just write. Every word is calculated by Esther and Mordechai, and therefore every word is telling us something. What is the Yom Tov? The Yom Tov means Melamed Sha'asr b'siyas Melacha. Like any holiday, you're not allowed to do work. If you're not allowed to do work, how would Rebbe plant a tree and plant a planting on the Purim? Okay, again, like we've learned already, Gemara is not anyone who wants to open up a Gemara and say, tell me the bottom line, doesn't understand what it means to study Talmud. Talmud is not a bottom line study. Talmud is, we study from the flow of a conversation. So although there could be what's called a havamina and a maskana, we've learned many times there's an initial thinking and then there's a conclusion, a maskana. But we learn from the havamina, like the Rebbe would always say, the havamina is Torah also, right? Even the thinking of the Talmud, the initial thinking of the Talmud, even if there's a conclusion. We had that in the end of last class, where we thought that Rebbe was trying to change the whole law of Tisha B'Av, and the conclusion was that he just tried to push it off if it was a Sunday. But from this we learn a lot about Tisha B'Av. So too in the conversation over here, we learn a lot. We learn throughout the flow of the conversation of the Talmud. Okay, it's not a book of law to say what's the law. This is a book of we're studying the conversation, and we learn from the conversation of the Talmud. So here the Gemara says, so it's a Yom Tov. So how could he plant? Meaning, if we stop here at the question, meaning to say he shouldn't have planted because it was a holiday, which means Purim is a holiday to the extent that you can't plant. Melamed Sha'aseh b'siyas Malachi, not allowed to do work. So the Gemara first answers, Ella Rabbi Bar Arbeisar Hava v'chinote b'chameisar nata. Okay, the Gemara says, well, hold on. Rebbe lived in the Galil, like we learned before. The story happened in Tzipori, right? So the question is, it says that Rebbe bathed in Tzipori, and we know that Rebbe lived in two places. He lived in Tiberias, which is by the Sea of the Galilee. And like we showed in the map last time, if you go up west, because the Galilee, the Tiberias is on the bottom, is on the plains. So, but if you're going up into the hills of the Galilee towards the sea, right? So you're going to get to one of the cities. You're going to get to is going to be. Hold on, some people are trying to get in over here. Oh, here we go. Shukibi, didn't have him in a while. So you're going to have hey Shuki, we're on 5b. So you're going to have a Tzipori. So where Rebbe lived in both places, Tiberias and Tzipori. So it says Rebbe was a 14th person. Sorry, was a 15th person, and he was a 14th person, and he planted on the 15th. So right, we said it's different. There's 15th and 14th. We said he planted on Purim, meaning he kept Purim on the 14th. He made the planting on the 15th, and it wasn't Purim for him. Rashi says, what does it mean he was a 14th person? He didn't live in a walled city. So when he planted on Purim, technically it was a Purim day for some people, but not for Rebbe, because Rebbe lived in a place of the 14th, so he didn't plant on the 14th. Right, so this is not so. First of all, again, we try to as much as we can in this Masechta that we're learning, is to learn a little bit of the laws that are brought down, not the halach and the ma'isa, but a little bit of discussion of the laws of the Rishonim. So we said that Rabbi Yosef said that there's two things that we learned from Simcha Mishta. Simcha Mishta we learned about eulogy and we learned about fasting. So the Ran and other commentaries, there's a big discussion about, we know, anyone who unfortunately has sat or is familiar with the laws of Avelis of mourning, that holidays break the mourning. Like if you're sitting Shiva and a holiday comes, Sukkos, then you get up, even if it's 1, 2, even if it's a few hours. If you went to the burial, if the shloshim, so the Torah, we learned, I think we learned in Rosh Hashanah possibly, but we learned that there's the Yom Tif and breaks the Shiva. The question is, does one sit Shiva on Purim? Now Shiva, the first day of Shiva, the first day of sitting of mourning is biblical. The 7 days, the full 7 days is rabbinic. Now, it's not possible. So the Rishonim bring down. It's not possible for Avelis, which is biblical, to be moved to the side for the holiday, although it's a communal holiday. But it's rabbinic. So rabbinic doesn't have the power to uproot a biblical. So the Ram brings down that since it's that pshita. Shinoig, that you definitely sit Avelis the first day if it falls out on Purim.
Yeah.
But what happens if Purim falls out on the other days? So then it becomes questionable if it's considered a holiday because does the rabbinic holiday of Aaron, I see that you want to ask a question when I'll get to you in a second. Do we have a rabbinic holiday? Does the rabbinic holiday, which is communal, uproot the individual's mourning, which is also rabbinic? So there's a discussion with the rabbis have with regard to this. And there's a question back and forth if we what we do, and he says that if it's doich or not, he brings down, if I'm not mistaken, the Maisa that the Mechaber brings down, the Shulchan Aruch brings down that call divrei aveis nahagim b'Chanukah b'Purim. That the halacha lemaisa is, according to the Mechaber, meaning the Beis Yosef, the Rabbi Yosef Karo, is that we continue to sit avelis even on Chanukah and Purim. But the Ramah, meaning the Ashkenazic opinion is the nagush ein avelis nagus lei yudad v'lei b'tesvav, that you do not. The minig is, the custom is. I'm assuming he means if from the second day forward, you will not sit avelis. You don't do the customs of avelis, like Shabbos. Doesn't mean there's a question of there's a difference in if it stops the avelis or if you don't do avelis. So the Ramah says that on the 14th and 15th you don't do avelis. It seems from there that you would continue afterwards. Now, with regarding to fasting, also we don't fast. The question is, what is the halachic requirement for Purim? It's not so clear if the halachic requirement for Purim is a suda, meaning you have to wash a maitzi, you have to wash on bread and make a proper meal with bread, or if you have to just eat something for like a fruit. So there's a difference of opinion, but the halacha is that you have to make a moitzi, and therefore you have to say the alanisim because you have to have a suda. If you forget the alanisim and benching, you would go back. Yes, Aaron.
Okay, so when you are mourning, you're not allowed to dance, hear music, but all the suitors I go to, they want to make it joyous, so they make it with dancing and music. As a mourner, can't go to a public party.
Okay, I'm not, again, like I said, it's not a halacha class here. From what I'm quoting over here, it seems from the Ramah, from the Beis Yosef, which would be the Sephardic opinion, which would be that you continue avelis. He says over here, I have to see the text inside, that the Ramah says that it could be that it means b'ferhesia, publicly. I mean, like Shabbos publicly, although privately we have certain things on Shabbos we keep also. Possibly he means like the Shabbos. I have to see with the Mefarshim on it, the Mishnah Brura and others. But if he means that it's totally uprooted, then you would be able to be at the festivities. If it means just before Hesia, then you could sit there maybe, but to actually be dancing in the music and all maybe would be a little inappropriate. But I have to check. I have to check on that. I'll post once I check on that. But good question.
Maybe another follow-up question. So,
Sure.
what you're saying, let's say you're in Israel, and the first day of Avelus is Erev Purim. Should you make a point of trying to go to Yerushalayim so you don't celebrate until the day after?
I'm saying the first day of Avelus would be on the 14th, and
Right.
you're keeping the 14th, let's say, in Tel Aviv, and you're saying, but then because of that you missed Purim. So you're saying should you try to go to the 15th to be the 15th in Yerushalayim so you could do the mitzvahs of Purim? Is that
Right.
the question? Okay.
Yeah.
I would have to check on that, possibly. I think the problem also would be is that in the laws of the keeping the second day is you would have to be okay, I mean, it's not so hard. If let's say Shkia or Tzeis, as long as you get there before morning in Yerushalayim, so then you're obligated to hear the Megillah on I'm not. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not. The laws of 14 and 15 are not easy when you're in the same area, and the problem would be that if you were full 14 in let's say Tel Aviv, or let's say Beit Shemesh, anywhere outside of the boundaries of Yerushalayim, and so then that is your Purim. So for you to go and do Purim on the 15th, it's not obligatory. I'm not sure if you could make the brachas on the, you could listen to the Megillah, you could do the festivities, you could join the spirit of Purim, but I'm not even sure if it would be doichet, because once you are on the 14th and that's your day, the Ramah says Arba Asrei Yudal and Yud Beis. I don't know if he means Yudal and Yud Beis for everyone, or Yudal for the people of Yudal and Tasvav. Sorry, Tasvav for the people of Tasvav. I have to check exactly on that. But if he means that in general, no matter where you are, Yudal and Tasvav, there is no Avelis, and then the question is if it's for Hesed or not. Could you to go to if you fulfilled your if you are on the 14th, that means that's your Purim. So then you may not, and so you have to keep the first day, but that's your Purim. You can't go now get another Purim, and because of the second Purim, take off the laws of Avelis and celebrate it properly. But even because it may not be rabbinic enough for you to push off the rabbinic of the obligation of 7. You understand? So these are actually complicated questions, because it's clearly, from what I'm looking at over here, is that it's machlokes the Beis Yosef and the Ramah, where the Beis Yosef says that that the minhag is to keep Avelis on Purim, where the Ramah says that it's not Yudal Tesvav. So the question number one is, Yudal Tesvav means for everyone or just the people of Yudalad or the people Tesvav. But one thing's for sure, that if you are in Yudalad in Tel Aviv, and it's the first day, which is Daraisa, but that's your Purim, because you stated that according to the halacha, that's your Purim, just that your Daraisa overrides the Purim. So that doesn't override it enough to make it that now if you're going to be Tesvav, so therefore you didn't do Purim because the Raisa, therefore you now became a Tesvavnik. Because if you're a person who keeps the full, but again, the laws of 2 Purims are not easy also, because according to some opinions, you would have to keep both Purims. So these are questions that have to be asked. We have to go into examine more, but all good questions, and I don't have the answers. Okay. Yeah, so it has to be checked. I mean, this falls under the laws of how you keep 2 days Purim and what the Ramah means by Yudal and Tesvav. But the point is, Rebbe is a 14th person, he's not a 15th person. Okay, so we covered 2 things. Okay, so we have the Hesped, we say that we don't do Hesped. I mean, we don't see, Avelis, we have the discussion about Avelis. First day, that Raisa, seemingly, according to most opinions, it would be clearly you keep it, because that Raisa, the biblical, can't get pushed away by rabbinic, and Purim, even if it's Divrei Kabbalah, we said, it's still not biblical. And with regard to fasting, it says, like, he brings down, the Ritva says, that if you ate fruit, and the fruit's enough to be considered eating on Purim, then maybe you could fast the rest of the day. But if you have to do Mishta, maybe if you wash, it's different. Okay, so Rashi says, Tosaf says like this, Shasurim behesped. So, I'm not sure what this means, Heshiv Rashi. We're not sure which Rashi he means. This is a printing mistake. So this is the question we asked. Who gives the power to the Megillah, meaning Purim, to push away the laws of mourning? So seemingly Tosfos says, and if you're talking about that, it says Yimei Mishta Simcha, and because of that you have to be happy and you can't eulogize. Well, we see people do eulogize. So Tosfos disagrees that we're not talking about Hesped. We're talking about Tachnun. When he says Simcha, we don't mean Hesped, we mean Tachnun. Neifel means we don't fall, which is an indication, which is a lashon for Tachnun. It's not a day that we have tzara of suffering, and this is one of the days that are on the list that we don't say Tachnun, which is the halacha. We do not say Tachnun. But Rashi, Tosfos doesn't subscribe at all to the concept of Megillah Esther pushing away not Avelis, and doesn't make a difference between the first or second day, and also about any even Hesped, even about eulogies. So the Gemara says, one second, back to the Talmud. The Gemara says, whoa, you're saying, again, we learn everything from the discussion. The Gemara, to approach the Gemara as what's the bottom line is just not how one approaches the Talmud. So the Gemara says, Eini, what do you mean? How could you say that Rebbe planted on the 15th because he's a 14th person? Eini, it's not so. Rebbe Teverya hava. Rebbe lived in Tiberias, which is again on the Kinneret. We discussed before if this is the Teverya of today or if it's further south. Vitveria, there's a national park over there. Vitveria mukefes chayme mi Yehoshua bin Nun. Tiberias is a city that was walled from the days of Joshua, which i.e. would make it a 15th city. So how could he have planted on the 15th if he was a 15th person? So obviously, what would the obvious answer be? The Rebbe Baruch HaMeser, have you right? He was the 15th. V'chinota, when he planted Bar Basi, he planted on the 14th. Again, it's not a game where the Gemara is at, because this seems like simple questions with simple answers. First of all, it's stretching the information. So we should understand more and more about, is Teverya a walled city or not? Did Rebbe live in Teverya? Because we learned also he was in Tzipori. When did he plant the 50 on the 15th? Was he in Tzipori at the time? Means even if Rebbe lived in Teverya, he moved to Tzipori clearly at one time because he was bathing, and we know that he lived at the end in his life in Tzipori. When we say that he was a 15th person, he planted on the 14th, meaning to say is he kept the laws of the 15th after he left Teverya? These are all questions that have to be understood. But this is all part of the discussion of the Talmud. And so Rashi says, Teverya, Tiberias, Mukefes Chaimim Yehoshua bin Nun, the common Mikra. We'll learn later how we know that Tiberias was a walled city. Now you have to remember something else. There's a difference between Teverya. The name Tiberias is after the Caesar Tiberias. So I mean, that's obviously, even though maybe that was before Rebbe's time, that was Caligula, Tiberias, and Herod built it as he was friends with Tiberias, but that doesn't make it a walled city from the times of Yehoshua bin Nun. So obviously it was a city before Herod built it as for the Caesar, but he rebuilt a city that was walled in the days of Joshua. And we learned the walls didn't have to be standing because the walls of Jerusalem weren't standing. It just had to be a city that was walled during the days of Yehoshua bin Nun, and Teverya was one of those cities. So when Herod built a city for Tiberias, he built a city that was once a city. So the Tosfos says, Rebbe lived in Tiberias. Nira Shahaya b'mei Antoninus. So Rashi Tosfos says, when was this? This was in later. Rebbe was. There's a famous story. I'm not sure if it's a Medrash or a Gemara. Rebbe was connected almost from birth to Antoninus. Antoninus, we're not sure if Antoninus was the emperor himself or the governor of the Middle East, but either way, he was very close. We're not sure who Antoninus was, which Caesar he was. But Antoninus is super close to Rebbe, not just close in political relationship, but personal. Rebbe taught him Torah. There's even opinions that Antoninus converted. Antoninus was when he was privately, in just him and Rebbe, he served Rebbe as a servant, because of Rebbe's greatness of Torah, and he loved Torah, Antoninus. So that's why the Gemara says, if you open up a Chumash, and Parshas told us, and you look at the Rashi, when it says, when Rivka goes, so Antoninus comes from Esav, right, Rome. So when Rivka goes to Shem and says, I have two, and Shem says, you have two kings, two nations in your stomach, who are the two nations? Rebbe and Antoninus. That's what the Rashi brings down. So that they were equal in this. What's brought down that Antoninus's attraction to Torah mitzvahs and to Yiddishkeit was because of their parents switched babies. Their parents were close, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's wife nursed Antoninus, and Rebbe was with Antoninus's mother because they were killing all the boys if they were circumcised. That's another story. But either way, Rebbe lived in Teverya in the days of Antoninus, when they were together. The Gemara teaches us in Avodah Zarah, because of Antoninus' close relationship with Rebbe and his appreciation for teaching and Torah. Like I said, he served Rebbe in private. That basically, because of Antoninus's affection for Rebbe and the Torah, he was going to make Tiberias a tax-free city. And that, why would he make Tiberias a tax-free city? Because Rebbe lived in Tiberias. So if Rebbe lived in Tiberias and Antoninus and the yeshivas were there, therefore he wanted to make it a tax-free city, meaning that the Talmidei Chachamim, the rabbis, shouldn't have to pay taxes. Very much connected to the political situation today, the draft question and other questions. Antoninus was giving special privileges to the Torah scholars. So it's not a new thing, it's a 2,000-year-old conversation. But hold on a second, before we go to the Gemara's next question, obviously. the question is also, someone who asks, it's not clear that if Rebbe himself was there, just that the yeshiva was there. But it says that afterwards he lived a little bit in Teverya, and afterwards he went to Tzipori. He moved up to Tzipori. Tzipori again is in the mountains, in the hills. Better, Rebbe suffered from a lot of illnesses, from his stomach especially. The Gemara tells us of Rebbe's stories. But Rebbe went at one point. He moved, like we learned. Rebbe Steinsaltz told us he relocated from Tiberias to Tzipori. So the Gemara says okay, fine. So now we established that Rebbe is a 15th person. Why? Because he lives in Teverya. If he lives in Teverya, so he kept Purim on the 15th. And when did he plant? He planted on the 14th. Okay, this is all based on the assumption that you're not allowed to work on Purim because it says Yom Tov. We're going to get to that. We're going to readdress that question. But we're talking out the Talmud. So now the Gemara says, 1 second. Hold on. Whoever said, what makes it so obvious that Tiberias is a city that was walled in the days of Yehoshua bin Nun? That meaning that it would be a city that they kept Purim on the 15th. Chizkiah, another scholar, he kept on Purim, he read the Megillah both on the 14th, on the 15th, both days. He was not sure if it was a city that was walled, and based on the doubt, I'm going to get to this in a second, because it's not so simple. When you have a doubt in a rabbinic question, it could actually be more, so to say, disruptive, because suffix Rabbanan lahakal, and maybe you don't have to read Megillah at all, because if you have a suffix, you don't know which day it is. Could you make a bracha, right? So here we have Chizkiyahu doesn't know if it's 14 or 15, and therefore he read the Megillah on both days. So the Gemara says, what's the Gemara answer to that question? It's okay. It's okay. The Chizkiyahu was not sure, Rebbe was sure. Right? So Chizkiyahu had his doubts, Rebbe didn't have doubts. So here he says, I'm
a little confused though.
Yeah, go ahead.
When does Chizkiyahu, I'm trying to think like chronologically, if that even makes sense. Why would Chizkiyahu be reading Megillah?
You're talking about, he's not Chizkiyahu, this king. It's Chizkiyahu, the scholar.
Okay, no.
Rabbi Chizkiyahu. Okay, so here we have, the question is like this. Was Chizkiyahu even right to read? Is he right? Till today, there's a halacha about certain places. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Teverya still has that question. I think the law, the practice, I should say, not the law, the practice is like Chizkiyahu. I think they do read 2 days in Teverya. The question is like this. The question is, what do you do when you have a suffix? What do you do when you have a doubt? Do you go with the majority? It means if you're not sure a city is walled, right? So if it's a city that's not walled, so how would you act on such a doubt? Go with the majority. It means the majority cities are not walled. If you don't know which city this is, then put the city in with the majority. If that's not so simple, because kol kavua k'mechsa mechsa. I don't know if you could establish a doubt in a location to go after the roiv because it's a kavua. There's rules of when you could go with the majority. But there's a question. Maybe just go with the majority. And majority cities are not walled, so you would have to assume this is also not walled city. And I'm not sure also if the question of kol kavua k'mechsa mechsa would be applicable to this question. Where do we apply it to? Where if there's one non-kosher store and there's 9 kosher stores and you have a piece of meat and you don't know where you got it from, but each store is a kavua set, so it doesn't get a lot. We don't say, well, if there's 9 stores kosher, we have to assume we took from the kosher because it's kavua. But I don't know if that would apply to this question, to the suffix, if the city of Tiberias was walled or not. But there's at least the thought of saying that we would go, if you don't know, go with the majority. Majority is that most cities are not walled. So maybe just go with reading the 14th. Or there's even a bigger complication. If you say that you have a doubt, and it's a real doubt, suffix to Rabbanan lahakal, then whenever you're doubting on a rabbinic question, you go leniency. Leniency means you wouldn't read it at all. Okay. So they discussed this question. So the Ran writes that he didn't have to read both days just because he had a doubt. He read both days Midas Chasidus Naokach. He kind of did above the letter of the law, called Midas Chasidus. Avu Midina, the Ran says, but according to the law, the Ran says you would go after Roy Vayarais, after most cities, which would be the 14th, because you'd go with the majority, which have not been walled in the days of Yehoshua bin Nun, and you'd read on the 14th. And he calls that even if it's a suffix shakel, it's rabbinic, and therefore you go lakula. And he says lakula means leniency would be that maybe you'd go to the 14th. Sorry, the Ran says that if you're going to go with suffix to Rabban and lakula, then you wouldn't read at all. So better to read on the 14th and go after the roiv. Okay, but he says, based on the fact that he did Midas Chasidus, according to the Ran, he can't make blessings on both days. He would only make the blessings on the 14th, and the 15th he would read without a blessing because he's really just doing the extra because of the doubt. And so writes the Rambam, and in chapter 1, law 11, and the Shulchan Aruch brings down the same thing. And he brings down also, like this, he quotes a place called, a sefer called Shemaim Rosh, that even if you have historical books, meaning from the nations, history books, not Jewish, that talk about a city that was walled in the days of Yehoshua bin Nun, we don't trust those books to read on the 15th. He writes, the Levush writes, Levush is a commentary on the halacha. This is an interesting thing. He writes like this: the Kol Ayares b'Europa, all the cities in Europe, Yitzafan Oilam in the north, Kulan Layayu Mishavis Bisman Yeshua. You should know, Europe was not settled in the north by the days of Joshua. When did Europe start to become populated? The Levush writes, only after the Jewish people entered the land, meaning by the time the Jewish people entered the land, there was no Europe, i.e. there is no cities in Europe, no matter what they write, for you to keep the 15th. But if you have places in the south, then the Levush says that maybe you have to be concerned if they have walled cities in the times of Joshua. And he quotes the Rashash that says that he heard from someone that in Hebron also was a city that they weren't sure if it was walled in the days of Yeshua. Okay. Now the Gemara asks the question. Umi pshitile the Teverya mekefes chayma. V'chi pshitile mishari. Just because Rebbe is certain that Tiberias is a 15th, meaning a walled city, though Chizkiah doubted it, and therefore he planted on the 14th, it's still he shouldn't have planted on the 14th. Why? Megillah's Tainus was a Megillah, like we're going to see, Rebbe Steinzalt says, was although they didn't write the Mishnah, the laws, until Rebbe, they had kind of light publications where they would just write things kind of, so to say, to remember. And one of those things are called Megillah's Tainus, where there may be one main author, but many people contributed it. And over there it writes about Purim, Es Yom Arba Asav, Es Yom Chamisha Asav, Yemei Puria Inun, to Limisbad Behind. It says that the 14th and the 15th are Purim, meaning, this could go back to the question that Avi, you asked about the Ramah paskening of no hesped. He says they're both on the 14th and the 15th together as a unit. You don't do hesped, meaning you wouldn't do avelis, which maybe then you could go back to your question that if you're able to get to the 15th to the Yerushalayim, and it's not, and if the law is that it doesn't push off after the first day, so maybe you'd be able to celebrate Purim possibly, because the Megillah Tainus says 14th and 15th as a unit, 2 days. Yemei are plural of Purim delay mispadu, meaning to say it doesn't make a difference if you're on the 15th or the 14th. Purim is 2 days. For most things, although you don't celebrate it 2 days, but it's a 2-day where you don't do eulogy and you don't work. So seemingly, that's what the Gemara understands from Megillah Tainus. Just because Rebbe kept the 15th doesn't mean he's allowed to plant on the 14th. Okay, so the the Reb Steinsaltz gives us a little insight on Megillah's Tainus. What is Megillah's Tainus? So he says Megillah's, until the Mishnah was written, writing down the oral Torah was prohibited. However, it was standard practice for scholars to write down notes for personal use. It means it wasn't published, but personal to remember, known as hidden scrolls. Megillah's Tainus was the first book, apart from the Bible, that was written. This scroll, to which we have access today, includes a list of days on which it's prohibited to eulogize the deceased or fast due to the miraculous and joyous events transpired of these days, meaning Purim. The scroll is written in two languages. The primary halacha, the day in two languages. The primary halacha, the day and its legal status, is written in Aramaic, while the descriptions of what happened each day are in Hebrew. Okay. Although Megillah's Tainus is attributed to Hanina ben Chizkiah and his son, they did not author the entire work. Events were added in later generations, continuing until the reduction of the Mishnah. So until the Mishnah, people kind of contributed to Megillah's Tainus. But in Megillah's Tainus, it says about when it quotes different days, it says that the days of the 14th and 15th. So V'amarav, and Rav teaches us, what does it mean the 14th and 15th? We don't need the Megillah's Tainus to tell us that. If the Megillah's Tainus means if you think that Megillah's Tainus means that you have to keep Purim on the 14th, and you have to keep if you live in an unwalled city, and you have to keep Purim on the 15th if you live in a walled city, you didn't have to write that down in Megillah's Tainus to tell us that. The reason why you wrote it down as such is whatever you can't do, whatever is prohibited, means biblical to keep the days. Obviously, you keep it on the 14th and 15th according to where you are. But as far as the prohibitions of the day, of not eulogizing, etc., it's the whatever you can't do on these days, you shouldn't do on the other days, including work. If you can't do work on the 15th, then you shouldn't be able to do work on the 15th, on the 14th, even if you're a 15th person. So the Gemara answers, Haini mili beheser b'tainis, avamalacha yom echad v'sulai. So first the Gemara answers like this, that when it says that you have to keep both days, it doesn't mean about everything. It only means about eulogy and about fasting. You can't fast, or according to Tosfos, he would say you don't say Tachnun, which that's the halacha. Even if you keep the 14th Shushan Purim, we don't say Tachnun. But when it comes to work, you only don't work on one day, and that depends on which day where you are. It says, we don't need Megillah's Tainus that tells us that you're not allowed to do hesped. It says already Simcho Mishta. We know right from the Megillah itself you're not allowed to eulogize. So what is it adding in Megillah's Tainus to make it both days? So the Rebbe says it's only both days for eulogy and fasting, but not for work. So the Gemara continues. Again, this is a flow of the Gemara. So we learn a lot in the flow. That's the point. But in Gemara, the idea is to analyze, to be very present with every statement of the Talmud, because we're learning something from it, we're understanding the thinking of the Talmud, etc. So the Gemara says, Eini, how could you say that? That it's only one day that you can't do work. Rav chazilahu gavra. Rav sees a certain person, the havikashadi kitana b'puriaya, that he was planting flax on Purim. He kind of cursed him, or the flax didn't grow. It means it wasn't a successful planting. So the Gemara says, well, it's not a question, because that person was doing it on the day that he should have been keeping Purim. Okay. From all this, actually, seemingly we're learning things like, meaning to say that Purim, it's forbidden to work. And because this person was working on his day, Rav kind of cursed that it shouldn't grow. Well, we're going to see that all these things come back even if we don't hold that it's forbidden. Like it's brought out in halacha. Although the maskana is going to be, the conclusion is going to be that Purim is not prohibited to work, but our custom is to honor the day anyways. And it's brought down in halacha. Whoever does work on Purim is not going to see bracha. Why? Where do we see it clearly from Rav? A person planted flax, and he didn't see bracha, it didn't grow. So we'll get there. Shadi Kisna Zereh Pishtan, he was planting flax. Bar Yom Havas, the Gemara says, okay, that was his day. He planted, he violated his day. Shekar Boy B'nai Iri, that was the day his city was reading. This Rashi, I'm not seeing any commentary. I didn't see if there's a marsha on it, but the point is that if you just read the wording, Shekar Boy B'nai Iri, that the people of his city read, you can maybe think that he wasn't with his people of his city at that time. Meaning to say, like Avi asked, what happens if you live in Tel Aviv and you want to go to Yerushalayim to celebrate Purim on the 15th, in the case where you can't celebrate on the 14th? Maybe he was a 14th person, or whatever the day was, and he went to a place where for that year, he didn't have to keep that day because he was in another place. Let's say he lives in Tel Aviv and he went to Yerushalayim for that Purim. Because it doesn't say that it was his Purim, but Bar Yoimei Hava Shekar B'nai Iri, that his city read it on that day. What's Rashi telling us? That his city read it on that day. If he was himself there, then that's when the day he has to read. Why does it say that his city read it on the day? It could be Rashi means to say that the city read it on the day, even though he wasn't reading himself on that day. But he belonged to a community that read it on that day. But I don't know that that's what Rashi means, but that you could maybe understand that in the wording of Rashi. The Sfas Emes says, okay, we'll get back to this Sfas Emes in a second. So the Gemara said this Rashi is out of place. You have to go back to it. Rabba Bray, the Rav Amr, Rabba, the son of Rava, says, I feel Tem B'Yom, you could say it was really the day of Hesped V'Tanis Kablu Elai Malach Like Kiblu. This is the Maskana. See? We got all the way to Maskana, now we get to the story. That Rabba says, one second, and this goes back to Rebbe, and this goes back to everything. That the Rebbe himself, or this person of Rav, we'll get back, that Rebbe himself he planted a tree on that day, on the day of Purim. And wherever it was, if he celebrated the 15th, they celebrated the 14th. But the Jewish people never accepted upon themselves it as a Yom Tiv. That's why if you look at it, that it says the first year, Esther Mordechai say it was a Yom Tiv. But when it talks about, in the wording of the Megillah, it says, Simcha v'Mishta, doesn't mention Yom Tiv. And why? Because Mordechai and Esther wanted it to be Yom Tiv, the Jews didn't accept it. That's I feel Tema B'Yom that Rebbe planted on his day. Hespe v'Tanis Kibul Olayu. The Jewish people accepted upon themselves not to eulogize, not to fast. Malacha like Kabbalah, they didn't accept to make it a holiday, i.e., that it was a day that's forbidden in work, and that's the halacha. Halachically, Purim is not like Sukkot. But the question is, what's about the story of Rav? If, according to this answer, that the Jewish people didn't accept upon themselves malacha, so why did Rav curse this person? So he says, Sfas Emes brings down from the Ritva that he says, he quotes over here. We're going to see also the Gemara brings down. He says, the Mai Shalei B'Yom Chiyuvai. Sfas Emes and Ritva also understand that this person didn't plant on his obligatory day. Because if he was obligated, based on the understanding that you're not allowed to work, they would have excommunicated him, not just cursed him. But he says, from here we learn, from this story of Rav, we learn that though Rav didn't excommunicate him, he just cursed him. But you should know that this is brought down in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Law, that although you're allowed to work on Purim, if you work on Purim, you will not seize any success, ever, from the efforts you do on Purim. Now, again, if you're a professional, that it's required. But otherwise, I mean, for instance, there's a lot. The question is, could you even buy stocks on Purim? Right? You're not going to your office, but you're going to see successful efforts on Purim. That you have to ask your rabbi. But it says, the halacha says in Shulchan Aruch, Tafresh Sadik Vav, that Oisim Malacha b'Purim, Eni Roisim Brachim Oisim Malacha. I think there's a word La'olam. You'll never see success from that effort. Okay. So the Mikarech Siv, how do we know? How does Rabbi, the son of Rava, know that the Jewish people didn't accept, again, what we see from this whole conversation, and we see it clearly from the wording of the Megillah. I don't want to use the word in a disrespectful way, but it seems like Esther and Mordechai, who understood like they say now, everything that's going on now, right? A lot of us hear a story, okay, all right, whatever, they're bombing, they're not, like we don't really appreciate the miracles that are happening. Why? Because we don't know everything. And so therefore they say that the people know what's really going on, they realize the miracles. Mordechai and Esther knew better than anyone the danger the Jewish people were in. And the miracle, how miraculous it was for the story of Purim to happen. They were the people involved. The rest of the people kind of got, they knew that there was a decree and the decree was nullified. They didn't maybe take it so seriously. And because of Mordechai and Esther's knowledge, they weren't just trying to promote their story, but they were the heads of the Jewish people and they knew the story. So they were trying to make that the Jewish people should understand and appreciate what happened here, how severe the situation was, how crucial and how likely it was, if not for the miracle, for the Jewish people to be wiped off the map. And the Jewish people didn't really appreciate that. And therefore we see them in the language of the Megillah, they're pushing the holiday. Sheinis, they have to write a second year. So it says the Mikarach Tiv Simcha Mishtav Yamtiv. So how do we know that the Jewish people didn't want to accept 100% what Mordechai and Esther wanted? Because initially it says that he said you have to be happy, i.e. no eulogy, Mishta means no fasting, and Yamtiv means no work. Well, the Messiah Chsiv last say you may Mishta of Simcha. It skips out the word Yamtiv. It says that they made it a day of festivities and happiness. They only accepted eulogy and fasting. They didn't accept not to make it a day of work. It doesn't say. And because of that, the Jewish people they weren't able to implement as strong as a holiday as they would have liked. So then Gemara asked the question, like we asked before. If that's the case, what was Rav's issue? Why was Rav cursing this person who planted flax? Rav my time gavra. So we have a question on this. So if the reason why Rebbe planted a tree was even on his day, so why is this person any different than Rebbe? Why could Rebbe plant a tree and he does it publicly? And this person who plants flax, Rav curses him. So Rav says, so the Gemara says, because in the community that this person lived in, people upgraded their behavior. And although it wasn't required, they kept it as a day, like Shulchan Aruch says you should, and they didn't work. His people in his community didn't do work. And this person went against what his community was doing, and he worked, and therefore Rav thought that was inappropriate. And therefore he doesn't excommunicate him, he curses him. However, in Rebbe's area, there was no such custom. Basrei de Rebbe, Rebbe's place didn't keep that idea of holiday. Therefore, it wasn't inappropriate for Rebbe to plant. But again, it seems from this story, it wasn't just that someone caught Rebbe planting. Rebbe made a statement by planting. The question is, according to this, where we're holding right now in the Talmud, in this little section, what was Rebbe thinking? What was the point of the statement? Was his point of a statement to show that in his area they didn't accept it as a holiday? Was he making a statement that it's not a holiday? And Rav felt that if you're part of a community that nevertheless keeps it as a holiday, although it's not required, but it's something that they accepted upon themselves, you shouldn't exclude yourself from the community. But for whatever reason, we see clearly that Rebbe was making a point where the Gemara is holding in this part of the conversation. So Tosfos says, and this applies in general. This is not just the rule of Purim. If you live in a community where people have accepted upon themselves something that's permissible, but they became more strict and they were asur, they made it prohibited, caution. And this actually comes into today's acting a little bit, playing out in the question of an Erev, right? You have an Erev, you have some communities that they come out very against an Erev. It's not even that there's a halachic question. But they say we don't want an Erev in our community for whatever reason. It's not so simple to be a person that carries publicly if there's an Erev. And there's places, I know that Gold is Green in London had this question, but there's places that's not too many years ago where this concept comes up that Dvarim HaMutarim V'Achem Nogam Hem Isur, that you shouldn't exclude yourself from the community. So the Gemara says, so Rato says Kasha. Okay, well, this is a side story about where Rebbe himself changed the law. Let's skip this part of Tosfos. Okay. With another answer, the Gemara says that, so how did Rebbe plant? So the Rebbe planted because in his place that wasn't the custom. And he seemingly wanted to make a statement about it. Or the Gemara says another answer. Lo'ilam nohug. No, the custom was not to keep Purim in a festive, in a holiday way. Yom Tov. Melacha. For Rebbe Nitiyah Simchanata. Rebbe did that, and that's why it makes more sense why he did it publicly. Rebbe came to teach us a halacha. That if you're planting something that is going to add joy, and Purim is a day of joy, the planting itself is an expression of joy, and therefore he planted it. It was a planting of simcha. Kiditnan, as we learn, what does it mean, a planting of simcha? Where does this come up? Ovru elu v'loinanu mematin b'masu matan b'binyin u'b'nitiyah be'erisin u'b'nisuim. It's talking about in the cases where we're fasting for rain. Till today we have this sometimes where the law is in the Masechtas Taanis it brings down. What does a person do if a person if a city doesn't get rain? So there's a system. The Tractate of Taanis deals with how the community continues to intensify the requirement of fasting and limiting work to mourn and to pray and to bring change that it should rain. So it says if we reached a certain point and it still hasn't rained, you're supposed to lessen in business, b'binyan in building, u'b'netiyah and in planting. Why would you have to stop planting? We see that because we were trying to do lessen things of joy because of the severity of the fast for the rain. So we see that planting could bring joy. Be'erisin, you shouldn't even get engaged. You shouldn't get married. Let's see Rashi. Rashi says, Nitiyah simcha, the kivan de Purim yom simchahu, because Purim is a day of happiness. More till entire Nitiyah simcha, you could do a planting of simcha. But from this we see something very interesting. From this we see that when even Mordechai and Esther, based on the understanding of this statement, when it says malacha, it doesn't mean, it can't mean malacha like what you're not allowed to do on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Because Shabbos and Yom Tov you're also allowed to be happy, especially Yom Tov b'yom simchasai, and there's no such provision that you're allowed to plant a tree for happiness on Shabbos or Yom Tov. So therefore, even they had it kind of when they meant Yom Tov, it meant to focus, don't work, don't go to your office, basically. Don't go to your office on Purim, it's a day of festivities. If you wait after the 13th fast and it still hasn't rained, and they didn't get answered, no rain, you're not supposed to plant. You less the planting in the building. We see that planting and building is a way of simcha. So Tosfos says, "Mimatim mimasamatin pirish shal simcha dumi de binyan v'netiyah de besamach aval shar binyanim sharu ve'en chamayis god matzin gadol mizeh." So he says when he says you have to lessen in business, it means business that you enjoy, shal simcha, like the building and the planting. But it's other building, which also requires business, right? When you do building, you're doing business. That's permitted. It's the simcha part that's prohibited. He says, you shouldn't be happy at all. And here he says, in this 14th fast is more severe than Tisha B'Av, because on Tisha B'Av you're allowed to get engaged. On this fasting, you're not allowed to even get engaged. That you have to lessen, but you're allowed to be a little happy. When he says mematin, what Tesis is basically saying is mematin doesn't just mean a little bit less. Mematin means no simcha. What's the proof? You can't even get engaged. But if you can say you're just a little bit less happy, but a little happy you can be, what's the definition of that? And because the Gemara doesn't give us a definition, means mematim in this case means do not do simcha at all. When you're not having grain, you have to totally dial down the simcha to 100%. So you should be serious about the fast. So Hashem should bless you with rain. So he says over here, I'm going to go back a second to some laws. He says when the sages decree fast for rain, and the 13th fast passes, and yet prayers have not been answered, i.e. there's no rain, and the rain has not fallen, it is incumbent upon the people to reduce. He uses the word reduce, but Tosfos says reduce in this case means to stop. There are business transactions that are for the purpose of happiness, as well as festive buildings and planting. Similarly, betrayals and other feasts are minimized as our wedding unless the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply has not yet been fulfilled. Here's quoting the Shulchan Aruch. So in the law, he says if you never got married, you're allowed to get married because you have the mitzvah of having children. But if you're just getting married and you already fulfilled that mitzvah, let's say second marriage, what have you, so then you can't get married because then there's no mitzvah. The mitzvah of having children is not there right now. So although there's a mitzvah to get married, but not in this moment. Okay. So just to finish off the Gemara over here, and we'll finish the piece. V'tana Allah, and we learned binyan shel simcha. What does it mean, a building? Like Tosfos says, a building of happiness. Nitiya, planting, a nitiya shel simcha, a planting that makes you happy. Eze binyan shel simcha, what does it mean to build a house that makes you happy? What's that defined by? For instance, when your first son gets married, the custom was out of excitement for the, you've elevated, you and your wife and your family have grown to now be in-laws and parents of a married couple, and that brings great joy of a family. So they would build a house for that, for the first son. It's mashma they would only build a house for the first son. I don't want to get into that conversation, but either way, they would build a house for their first son, and that you shouldn't do when you're fasting for rain because that's a building of simcha. Simcha, and what would be a planting of joy? Is that anoite avurniki shamalachim? If you are planting the joyful plant is a royal garden, where the kings would sit, where royalty would sit in the shade, kind of a really nice gardening thing, not a tree that is being planted for business or for fruits and vegetables, but something that you take pleasure in. That's considered a Natiyah Shel Simcha, and that's what Rebbe planted. He planted something along those lines. So he says, "V'natin Natiyah Shel Simcha binyan ha'omer kan she'oishrim binyan Shel Simcha she'noigin atzmim." The reason why you're not allowed to build like the house for your son-in-law, is because you're supposed to be like mourning. Because you're mourning, you're in tshuva for rain. It's not a time to build a house for your son who just got married or is getting married. What shouldn't you plant? A planting of joy, like a burniki, which is an ilan, a tree that is built for shade. They put it over poles and pegs, creating a shade, like a summer space, and the kings sit under it in the summer. And this is different kinds of joy that you take from sitting in the shade or building a house for your son. So Rashi says over here, when would they build a house to celebrate the marriage of their son? When your son married, when your livnei rishon, your first son got married. It doesn't say anywhere that you built a house for your second son. That's a joy. It could be that it was like a family house. It means that the son didn't live there forever, but you built like a wedding hall, like a house that had a house and a yard, and you got married there, and maybe they lived there for the first year or so, and maybe that's when the second son moved in there. That's why they would only build one. But it seems, but Rashi clearly says that you only built it for your first son. It could be for your first son, and then afterwards all your children used it, or maybe just because, like I said before, your first son gets married, and it's a milestone in the family, and therefore you expressed it by building him a house. All right. He says in the Aruch, it says the best textual witness to it, the reading is a kavurnika, which is apparently released related to the Middle Persian Gaonim note, the usage of Aramaic word to indicate pavilion built by kings in the garden. Okay. Either way, it's a kind of a garden experience. I think we're going to stop here in the Talmud. I just want to say, he brings down in the Lacha. It does say in the Megillah the word It does say afterwards that they did keep it as a Yom Tov. So why did we say before the Jewish people didn't keep it as a Yom Tov? That Mordechai and Esther they didn't subscribe. They kept to what they decided. They called it a Yom Tov, although the Jewish people didn't keep it as a Yom Tov. Means in the description of the month, Esther and Mordechai say it's a month of a Yom Tov. Again, it's not that Mordechai and Esther were kind of being aggressive about their party. They weren't selfish people or people that wanted to be recognized, that they were able to create a holiday. It's just that Mordechai and Esther really understood the danger and the miracle of what happened. And not everyone did understand. I think that's a lesson that we can take on for ourselves today, that, when there's miracles happening around us, and there is, plug into that. It's not like, don't just try to say, okay, whatever, it just happened. The Rambam says the harshest thing you could do to God is to make things happen as if it's casual and not pay attention to God's ashkacha pratis, that He's mamish made a miracle for you. And Mordechai and Esther understood that, and they wanted to teach it to the Jewish people by making it a holiday, and they only semi-accepted it by making it festivities and not to eulogize, but not to make it a Yom Tov. They weren't agreeing to go that far. Let's just finish off over here. I just want to quote. He says that Kosev Ramah, the Ramah writes that Idna Nogu B'chol Makom Shloi Lasas Mlacha. So the Ramah, which is again the Ashkenazic authority on the Shulchan Aruch, writes the Ha'idna, the minig is, it doesn't say the halacha, the minig, the custom is B'chol Makom, anywhere, in all places. That means there's not just cities here, cities there. Shloi Lasas Mlacha. We do not do work on Purim. However, the Mishnah Brura writes that that means just like labor, but things of simcha, like we see from Rebbe, and if you take joy in handling, like going in the stock market, or if that if you get a good buy in the stock, that makes you happy. So why shouldn't you do it on Purim? Just like Rabbi could plant a tree. So the Mishnah Brura says the permaktia shari, the things that are simcha in business, you're allowed to do. Okay, so one more thing over here. He says that the Rama also says that things that are mitzvah related, you're allowed to do when it comes to Purim. Okay, we'll stop over here and we'll start next week from Chizkiah, which says that the question about what is the status of Teverya. Thank you all for joining. Sorry, going a little over. Have a wonderful evening. Laila Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.